They don't chain you when you walk away from society's script. They do something worse. They make you feel like you're the problem. Like choosing authenticity over approval is somehow a crime against nature itself. You were never invited to write your own story. Society handed you a script the moment you were born and told you the lines were non-negotiable. Be a good boy, sit still, follow orders, don't ask too many questions. Then came school, the factory for obedience, where curiosity was punished and memorization rewarded, where compliance looked like character. You learned to raise your hand for permission to speak your own thoughts. You learned to sit in rows, face forward, and absorb information without questioning its relevance to your actual life. Next came work, where your value was measured in hours clocked, not thoughts challenged, where showing up meant more than waking up, where you traded 8 hours of your finite existence for enough money to survive until tomorrow's 8-hour trade. Then marriage, children, bills, mortgages, deadlines, weekends that felt like seconds, vacations that felt like recovery from survival, family dinners where you felt like a stranger at your own table. Your role was crystal clear: provide, protect, perform, produce, and never pause long enough to ask the question that terrifies every system. Is this even mine? Because this wasn't a life. It was a checklist designed by people who never had to live it. Birth leads to obedience. School teaches conformity. Work demands submission. Family becomes duty. Retirement brings decay. Death arrives as relief. Each stage sold as the next step forward. To what exactly? Happiness? Fulfillment? Purpose? In truth, each one designed to keep you too tired to rebel, too busy to question, too invested to walk away. You weren't encouraged to think. You were trained to function, to follow a timeline so rigid that any deviation looked like failure and any questioning sounded like weakness, a spiritual emergency disguised as immaturity. Even your dreams are outsourced, sold to you by corporations, movies, influencers, and algorithms that studied your desires better than you did. Dream big, they said, but only within our walls. Be ambitious, but only in ways that keep the machine running. The house in the suburbs, the car that announces your status, the watch that counts down your remaining time while displaying your success, the vacation photos that prove you can afford to escape the life you built. Because the moment you wake up and ask, what if I don't want this? You become a threat to the entire production. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this when he wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe." He called it the herd mentality, a society that worships conformity then disguises it as virtue, a system that doesn't care if you're still alive inside, as long as you play your role convincingly enough on the outside. And so millions of men stay quiet, not because they agree, but because they fear becoming the outcast. They fear the silence that follows truth. They fear the loneliness that comes with authenticity. They fear being labelled as ungrateful, selfish, or worse, unsuccessful. But here's what no one will say out loud. The system doesn't want men who think. It wants men who function, who produce, who obey, who repeat the same patterns without examining them. Because thinking men are dangerous. Thinking men ask why. And once you start asking why, you stop automatically saying yes. You start to see the invisible cage. You start to feel the weight of expectations that were never yours. You start to hear the desperation in other people's laughter, the exhaustion in their success stories, the quiet panic behind their busy schedules. And that's when the real journey begins. Not when you decide to leave, but when you finally admit you never truly arrived. The beautiful thing about a prison is that after a while, you forget you're in one. The bars become furniture, the walls become home, the routine becomes identity, the warden becomes your inner voice. You start believing that the paycheck is freedom, that the title is purpose, that the applause is love, that the exhaustion is virtue. You measure your own worth in metrics you didn't create: salary, square footage, social media followers, the approval of people whose opinions you don't even respect, the number of hours you can work without complaining, the problems you can solve for everyone except yourself. And the system rewards this beautifully. Every time you sacrifice a piece of yourself for the script, you get a pat on the head, a promotion, a good job, a sense that you're winning at something. But winning at what? The meetings that could have been emails, the small talk that fills the void where real conversations used to be, The forced smiles that hide the desperation you can't name. The networking events where you practice being interested in people you'd never choose to spend time with. You become an expert at performing strength while feeling empty inside. At looking successful while your soul slowly starves. At being busy while accomplishing nothing that actually matters to you. The French philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from a man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." And you understand this now, don't you? Because sitting quietly means facing the reality that you've been running from for decades. So you stay busy, always moving, always achieving, always climbing. Because motion feels like progress, even when you're just running in circles. Even when the ladder you're climbing is leaning against a wall you never wanted to reach. And the beautiful trap is this. Everyone around you is playing the same game, so it feels normal. It feels like just how life is. Your co-workers are all stressed and exhausted, but hey, that's just the grind. Your friends all hate their jobs, but that's just being an adult. Everyone's relationships feel transactional, but that's just being realistic. The whole system runs on one unspoken agreement. We'll all pretend this makes sense if you pretend it too. And for years, maybe decades, you do. You pretend the ladder you're climbing isn't leaning against the wrong wall. You pretend that retirement is the reward worth sacrificing your present for. You pretend that providing justifies never actually being present. You become so good at the performance that you forget it's a performance. The mask fuses to your face. The costume becomes your skin. The role becomes your reality. You start introducing yourself by what you do, not who you are. You start measuring time in productivity, not presence. You start seeing relationships as networks, not connections. You start treating your body like a machine that should function without maintenance. You learn to smile through exhaustion, to say, "I'm fine," when you're dissolving, to celebrate achievements that feel hollow, to chase goals that someone else set for you before you were old enough to have your own. Until one day, something shifts. Maybe it's subtle, a meeting that feels especially hollow, a promotion that brings no joy, a conversation with your kid where you realize you sound like a stranger reciting company talking points, or maybe it's dramatic, a health scare that reminds you your body isn't invincible, a divorce that exposes how transactional your most intimate relationship had become, a death that forces you to confront how little time you actually have. Either way, you suddenly see the stage lights. You notice the other actors going through the same motions. You hear how scripted all the dialogue sounds. You feel the weight of the costume you've been wearing. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The matrix becomes visible. The emperor's nakedness becomes obvious. The game reveals itself as exactly that, a game. But here's the thing about waking up inside a dream. Everyone else is still asleep, and they don't appreciate being disturbed. The moment you stop accepting the script, the real pain begins. Not the pain of leaving, the pain of realizing how long you stayed, how many years you traded for comfort, how many dreams you buried for security, how many versions of yourself you killed to become who others needed you to be. You start asking different questions. You stop chasing what no longer makes sense. You say less, you observe more, you begin to notice how artificial everything feels. Meetings feel like theatre performed by actors who've forgotten their acting. Conversations feel scripted, full of predictable responses and rehearsed enthusiasm. Smiles feel rehearsed, painted on to hide the exhaustion underneath. Success starts to look suspicious, a carnival game where everyone's a loser but nobody wants to admit it. And when you stop performing, people notice, but not in the way you'd hope. They don't say you seem clearer, more grounded, more alive. They don't celebrate your awakening or ask about your journey. Instead, they say things like, "Are you okay? You've changed. You're being reckless. What's gotten into you?" Sometimes they're more direct. "You're throwing away your future. Why would you ruin a good thing? Do you want to end up with nothing? Think about your family. Think about your reputation." Because in a world built on masks, removing yours looks like self-destruction. In a world built on performance, authenticity looks like failure. In a world built on pretending everything is fine, honesty looks like a mental illness. Carl Jung understood this dynamic perfectly. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When you stop playing the game, you become a mirror for everyone who's still trapped in it. When you live honestly, you force others to feel their own dishonesty. When you stop pretending, you expose the performance they've committed their lives to. When you choose presence over productivity, you remind them of all the moments they've missed, and that makes people deeply uncomfortable. Not because you're wrong, but because you're right. Your presence becomes a living reminder of the choice they're not making. Your peace becomes a contrast to their chaos. Your stillness becomes a judgment of their frantic motion. They'll call you selfish for choosing your own path, unstable for questioning their stability, irresponsible for refusing to carry responsibilities that were never truly yours. But the truth is, you're not destroying anything. You're simply refusing to keep building what was never real. You're not being negative, you're being honest about the negative space that was always there, hidden behind the busy work and false smiles. You didn't walk away to rebel. You walked away because you finally saw it for what it was. And once seen, it can't be unseen. Once you taste authentic life, the artificial version tastes like poison. You can't go back to pretending that the meeting has a point, that the small talk matters, that the competition is worth winning. You can't go back to chasing metrics that never mattered, to being praised for surviving systems that slowly drained your soul. And so the system reacts, not with violence, but with something more subtle and perhaps more cruel. Social pressure, guilt, shame, isolation. They don't burn you at the stake. They stop inviting you to the table. They don't exile you officially. They just make you feel like you don't belong anymore. You're labelled difficult when you ask direct questions, too intense when you prefer real conversations over surface level banter, not a team player when you refuse to participate in collective delusions. But deep down, they feel what you feel. They just don't want to admit it. They see the trap too. They feel the emptiness too. They question the point too. They just don't have the courage to say it out loud. So they double down on the lie, on the image, on the grind. Because if you're right, their whole life needs rethinking. And that's terrifying. It's easier to make you the problem than to face the possibility that they've been living someone else's dream. The Roman philosopher Seneca wrote, "Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. Your awakening requires the death of who you used to be, and death, even the death of illusions, is never comfortable. So you stand alone, not because you're lost, but because you're no longer participating in the collective lostness. Not because you're confused, but because you've stopped pretending that confusion is clarity. And in that aloneness, something beautiful begins to happen. You start to remember who you were before the world told you who to be." Here's what they don't tell you about walking away. You don't escape the script by fighting it. You escape by becoming too awake to recite it. This isn't about rejecting responsibility. It's about rejecting the performance of responsibility. It's not about avoiding hard work. It's about choosing work that doesn't require you to betray yourself to do it. It's not about being selfish. It's about being whole enough to serve from overflow instead of emptiness. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, "A man can do what he wants, but not want what he wants." For most of your life, you thought your desires were your own. You thought you wanted the promotion, the house, the status. But those wants were installed by a system that profits from your striving. Real freedom begins when you realize the difference between what you've been conditioned to want and what you actually need, between what the market demands and what your soul requires, between what others expect and what you can authentically give. Erich Fromm saw this clearly when he wrote, "Modern man lives under the illusion that he knows what he wants, while he actually wants what he is supposed to want." You didn't want more followers, you wanted to feel seen. You didn't want another promotion, you wanted your work to matter. You didn't want to be the richest guy in a room full of strangers, you wanted genuine connection with people who knew your real name. You just wanted to feel real again, to wake up and not dread the mask, to speak without filtering every word through, "How will this be received?" To breathe without the constant performance of being okay when you're not okay. You wanted your life back, not the version others applauded, but the one your soul could recognize. The one where your actions aligned with your values, where your time reflected your priorities, where your relationships were based on truth instead of utility. And here's the thing about authentic rebellion. It's quiet. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't require approval. It doesn't even need to be understood. Most men don't walk away in flames. They don't burn bridges or write angry letters to their former selves. They don't make speeches or start movements. They simply disappear. Not from life, but from the game. No public outburst, no dramatic exit, no viral post announcing their awakening. Just a gradual fading from the roles they no longer believe in. They stop arguing because they no longer need to prove anything. They stop chasing because they finally realised they were running in circles. They stop performing because the mask has become too heavy to carry. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal, like depression, like giving up. People will say that you're having a midlife crisis, that you're being irresponsible, that you're throwing away everything you've worked for. But inside, something entirely different is happening. A quiet revolution, not against the world, but within yourself. A dismantling of the false self and a reclamation of the authentic one. Henry David Thoreau understood this when he wrote, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, but he also showed us the alternative. I went to the woods to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could learn not what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." This is what walking away really means. Choosing to live deliberately instead of accidentally. Choosing presence over productivity. Choosing meaning over metrics. Choosing depth over speed. These men aren't loud because truth doesn't need volume. They're not angry because they've already grieved the life they were meant to live. They don't need validation because they've made peace with being understood. They know something you don't. The moment you wake up, you no longer need to explain why you're leaving. You simply walk into your own life, not toward applause, but toward alignment. Not toward success as others define it, but toward integrity as you feel it. You'll find them in quieter places now, in still mornings where they can hear their own thoughts, on long walks where the pace allows for actual reflection, in deeper conversations that skip the small talk and go straight to what matters. They are learning the sound of their own voice again after years of repeating what was expected. They are discovering what they actually enjoy when they're not performing enjoyment for an audience. They are remembering what peace feels like when it's not dependent on external circumstances. Their rebellion is subtle but powerful. They don't advertise their awakening, they live it. They don't compete for attention, they've learned the difference between being seen and being known. They don't measure themselves against metrics they didn't create. They've found their own scorecard. As the ancient Greek philosopher Epictetus wrote, "Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants." These men have learned to want what they have instead of having what they want. They've learned that enough is a decision, not a number, and in that learning, something rare begins to grow. Contentment that doesn't depend on circumstances, peace that doesn't require everyone else's approval, strength that doesn't need to prove itself. They're not running from life, they're returning to it. Not the life they were told to want, but the one they can finally hear calling beneath the noise. Walking away doesn't mean you're lost. It means you've stopped pretending you were ever fully found in their system. You didn't abandon your life, you abandoned their version of it. You didn't give up. You gave back what was never really yours. The titles that defined you instead of describing you. The expectations that shaped you instead of serving you. The image of a man you had to wear like an ill-fitting costume. You're not running from life, you're returning to it. Not the one manufactured for you by marketing departments and social conditioning, but the one waiting patiently inside you all along. This is not rebellion, it's reclamation, a taking back of territory that was always yours but somehow got occupied by forces that convinced you they knew better than you did about how to live your own life. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. You're learning this now. Happiness isn't a destination you reach through achievement. It's a byproduct of alignment between who you are and how you live. Because when you leave the script, you don't step into confusion. You step into authorship. You stop reciting lines someone else wrote. You start writing your own. You stop performing a character. You start embodying yourself. Your choices shift fundamentally, and the difference is night and day. You no longer work for applause, you work for alignment. You choose the job that feels honest over the one that sounds impressive. You chose the project that engages your actual interests over the one that advances your theoretical career. You chose to be useful over being celebrated. You chose stillness over constant motion, not because you're lazy, but because you've learned the difference between being busy and being productive, between activity and accomplishment, between motion and progress. You no longer speak just to fill silence. You speak only when you have something true to add. You've learned that your words have weight, and you use them carefully. You ask better questions because you're genuinely curious about the answers. You're no longer obsessed with winning because you've stopped playing games that cost you your soul to play. You've learned that some victories aren't worth the price of admission, that some competitions are designed to make everyone lose. You're not chasing anymore, you're choosing. And there's a world of difference between the two. Chasing is reactive, desperate, externally motivated. Choosing is deliberate, grounded, and internally guided. Because there's a difference between movement and progress, between noise and meaning, between being busy and being alive. Most people never stop long enough to see the difference. You did. And in that pause, that sacred space between stimulus and response, you found clarity. You realized that real maturity isn't about pushing harder. It's about discerning what's worth pushing for. It's about knowing when to engage and when to withdraw, when to speak and when to listen, when to act and when to wait. You don't need to be right anymore. You just need to be real. You don't need to win every argument. You just need to maintain your integrity. You don't need to lead the race. You just need to make sure you're running towards something that actually matters to you. Because freedom isn't the ability to win at their game. It's the wisdom to recognize when the game isn't worth playing. It's the courage to walk away from the board entirely and create your own rules for your own life. That's not immaturity. That's mastery. That's not giving up. That's growing up. That's not failure. That's finally understanding what success actually means for you specifically. You're not sabotaging your potential. You're redefining what potential even means. They told you success was a destination you reach through sacrifice. You learned it's a direction you choose through alignment. They told you happiness was rewarded when you earn through achievement. You learned it's a decision you make through presence. They told you purpose was something you find out there in the world. You discovered it's something you return to inside of yourself. When you stop trying to earn your worth, you remember something that was always true. You are not a man who gave up. You're a man who woke up. And that waking led you back to something ancient, something primal, something whole, a version of yourself that doesn't need permission to exist, doesn't need applause to have value, doesn't need to be explained to be valid. A man who chooses carefully because he understands the weight of choices, who moves slowly because he's learned that speed without direction is just chaos, who feels deeply because he's no longer afraid of his own emotional life, who speaks rarely but meaningfully because he's learned the power of words. And when he does speak, when he does act, when he does choose, people listen, not because he's performing or trying to convince them of anything, but because authenticity has a gravitational pull that performance can never match. Because it's no longer a performance, it's truth. And truth doesn't seek attention or approval or validation. It just is. And in that isness, there's a power that no script can manufacture and no system can replicate. That's why you walked away. Not to disappear, but to become visible again. To yourself first, then to others who are ready to see something real in a world full of counterfeits. You're not alone in this. There are thousands of men like you scattered across the world. Men who stopped pretending. Men who chose stillness over applause, honesty over image, reality over reputation. Men who decided that being whole and unknown was better than being famous for being fake. You won't find them on stages or social media feeds. They don't shout about their awakening or sell courses on how to follow their path. They don't start movements or write manifestos or create content about their journey. They simply walk quietly, intentionally, inwardly, away from the noise, away from the game towards something real, away from what they're supposed to want toward what they actually need. You'll recognize them not by what they say, but by what they don't say, by their comfort with silence, by their lack of need to fill every moment with activity or explanation. You'll see it in their eyes, the ones that no longer seek approval or validation, but reflect something deeper, peace. Not the peace of someone who has everything figured out, but the peace of someone who has stopped pretending to have everything figured out. You'll notice them at the edges of rooms, at the margins of conversations. They don't dominate the space, they anchor it. They don't demand attention, they command presence. They don't sell advice, they live by example. No fame, no spotlight, no microphone, and yet they shift something fundamental just by being themselves, just by refusing to participate in the collective performance, just by existing authentically in a world built on artifice. Men like you are not failures of the system. You are proof that the system can no longer contain every human spirit. You are evidence that something in the human soul rebels against being reduced to a function, a role, a number. You are the living contradiction that breaks the algorithm. Calm but awake, silent but burning, detached but fully present, successful by your own definition while being labelled unsuccessful by theirs. And that contradiction alone is enough to unsettle a world built on the illusion that there's only one way to live, one definition of success, one script that everyone must follow. Because your stillness is louder than their shouting. Your refusal is more powerful than their promotions. Your quiet walkaway is a more profound protest than 1,000 signs and slogans. You don't have to tear anything down. You simply stopped holding it up. And the moment you withdrew your support, the whole illusion became a little less stable for everyone still trapped inside it. You may feel invisible sometimes, misunderstood often, dismissed by people who mistake your depth for dysfunction. But what you carry within you is exactly what this world is desperately hungry for, even if it doesn't know how to ask for it. Men who live by principle instead of performance. Men who do what's right even when no one is watching. Men who would rather be whole and unrecognized than praised for a version of themselves they no longer believe in. Men who have learned that integrity is not a luxury, but a necessity. And men who understand that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of authenticity. You're not loud because truth doesn't need amplification. You're not angry because you've made peace with what you've walked away from. You're not broken, you're just no longer willing to be programmed. And that makes you dangerous in the best possible way. Not dangerous to people, but dangerous to systems that depend on unconscious compliance. Dangerous to narratives that require everyone to play along. Dangerous to institutions that profit from human beings forgetting who they are. You threaten nothing and no one except the lies that keep people trapped. Because even if one man steps off the stage and dares to live honestly, it gives others permission to question the roles they're playing. That's how the world changes. Not through revolution, but through evolution. Not through mass protests, but through individual awakening. Not through external force, but through internal transformation. One man at a time deciding he's had enough of the performance. One soul at a time remembering what it feels like to be real. One human being at a time choosing authenticity over approval. Men like you. Men who leave the spotlight and find themselves. Men who stop performing and start living. Men who trade the applause of strangers for the quiet approval of their conscience. You may never be quoted in history books. You may never be followed by millions. You may never be celebrated by the systems you walked away from. But you will be remembered by your children who learned they had permission to be themselves by watching you be yourself. By your friends who found the courage to stop pretending because you showed them it was possible. By strangers who felt something shift in their own souls when they encountered your authenticity. Because truth is contagious. So is courage. So is the quiet confidence of a man who has nothing to prove because he has nothing to hide. You are a quiet fire in a world addicted to noise. A still point in a world obsessed with motion. A real human being in a world full of characters playing roles they never chose. And that fire, that presence, that unwavering commitment to being exactly who you are is how everything begins to change. Not all at once, not for everyone, but for someone, somewhere, watching, waiting, wondering if it's possible to live differently. You are the proof that it is. You are not a rebel. You are not lost. You are not alone. You're not broken. You are just one man who stopped pretending. And in a world built on performance, that was the most revolutionary act imaginable. The revolution isn't coming. It's already here. It's happening in the hearts of men who choose authenticity over approval. In the silence of those who refuse to recite scripts they never wrote. In the stillness of souls returning home to themselves. Your walkaway isn't an ending. It's a beginning. Not just for you, but for everyone brave enough to follow the path you're making with every authentic step you take.